Welcome to my American History Notes, where I discuss conclusions I've drawn from studying American history, conclusions you might not accept, you might not believe, you might even be offended by. But the point is, for me, is that you come to your own conclusions about American history from your own studies. And if I make statement of a misstatement of fact, I say something wrong, or you find something maybe contradicts something I said, let me know. I appreciate learning. I'm trying to learn. I'm constantly trying to learn. So I'm not saying that what I say is the final word on anything. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I'm just a student of history. So I hope you'll listen and dig in and do your own studies. It's very interesting subjects. Now, let's begin here. Um, we're going to talk about some notable African Americans for the next few sessions. We'll do Native Americans, Asians, Latinos. We're going to try to include everybody in here before we go on to things like feminism, the uh, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. We're going to talk about all kinds of different stuff in American history because it all reflects on what's happening today, and it's important to know something about it. And all I'm hoping that you'll do is be conversant in American history, just have some ideas. So we're going to start. We're not taught African American history in high school. I mean, people complain about. They say, "Well, why do you have February as Black History Month?" Well, what about White History Month? Well, every month is White History Month. I mean, if you honestly are honest about it, and you're in high school, or you're in, I didn't know anything about Africa, or civilizations outside of Europe until I got to college, and then even beyond that. And when I did my study of world history for homeschoolers, I had a hard time finding a program that would include civilizations outside of, you think Greece and Rome and Europe was it. So we're going to study African American history first, do a few sessions on that before we go to others. But I'm going to do it's additional to what I've already done because we learned so little about the subject in school. I know some will say, why didn't you mention the names of white war heroes and important people who weren't political leaders? Well, they will say, what about white history? But I would say we have plenty of opportunity to study white history because government-run schools have always been about white history. This is touching on topics we don't hear much about. Black people and Native Americans are not, and nowadays with the Marxists in control, when you talk about Black history, you only talk about victims. You don't talk about people who were movers and shakers and did things and accomplished things. You're talking about, victims or politicians who lift up victimhood, which I'm not trying to do that. Okay, I'm talking about triumph. I'm talking about success. I'm talking about people of a strong will and a desire to have something, as we used to say down south, who are about something. So this is touching on topics we don't hear much about. Black people and Native Americans are not peripheral players, fringe actors in American history. Their history is essential to understanding American history, period. Now, to begin, only roughly 4% of the Africans kidnapped by African kings, European merchants, and African or European slave traders and sent to the Americas landed in North America. That's 4%. The vast majority went to Spanish, Portuguese, and French possessions. The first Africans to arrive in Virginia were from the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is modern day Angola. They've been a part of a larger shipment on its way to Mexico shipped by Portuguese ships. Portuguese slave traders and their African allies, like the marauding Imbagalas, raided Ndongo to gain slaves to sell. English privateers waylaid this part of this particular shipment, and the English ship, the White Lion, operating under Dutch letters of marque, which is a government license to be a privateer or a pirate, nice name for a pirate, against enemy ships, kidnapped 20 Africans from their original kidnappers. The primary source document in the records of the Virginia Company, 1619, says, quote, about the latter end of August, the Dutch man of war of the burden of 160 tons arrived at Point Comfort. The commander named Captain Job, his pilot for the West Indies, was Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. They met with the Trier in the West Indies and determined to hold concert ship hitherward, but in their passage lost one the other. He bought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, with the governor and Cape Merchant bought for victual, whereof he was in great need as he intended, at the best and easiest rate they could. He had a large and ample commission from His Excellency to range and to take purchase in the West Indies. This is written from a time when spelling wasn't standardized yet. So, it's kind of hard to read. I've discussed slavery in previous lessons, but wanted to focus on notable blacks at this point. The first notable black person may have been one of those kidnapped Africans who became known as Anthony Johnson. He not only secured his freedom, but became a successful planner himself. He's given credit, if I can be forgiven for using that phrase, for holding one of the first black slaves or indentured servants for life. He sought this lifetime sentence for a runaway indentured servant, a black man named, we think, John Kazor, who claimed his, or he might have been called Caesar, who claimed his term of servitude had lawfully ended. He had run away from Johnson's plantation, aptly named Angola for Johnson's homeland. In the 1650s, Johnson was granted Kazor for life when a court determined that Kazor was indeed a slave and not an indentured servant. And of course, this is before the Black Codes, just before the Black Codes, where everything changed. Um, there would be many more black slave owners, such as Larry Koger details in his work, Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790 to 1860. William Ellison was one of the largest slave owners in 1860 in South Carolina, according to the website face-to-faceafrica.com. He had 53 slaves by the time the Civil War began, being noteworthy for his cruelty in starving his slaves and being a breeder, selling all of his female slaves, except those kept for breeding purposes. There were, it was said, many kind black slave owners due to the commonality of their possessions with them ethnically, but there were also incredibly cruel ones. Nat Butler of Aberdeen, Maryland, was notorious for reselling runaway slaves he had tricked into hiding on his own property or returning them to their owners for a reward, enslaving them himself if that wasn't possible. The wealthiest black slave owner in Louisiana was Antoine Dubuclet, reportedly wealthier than all of his white peers by a long shot, owning over 100 slaves. So this is important in understanding. This will be important in understanding how communists became involved in the civil rights movement as they viewed the issue of racial oppression as a class struggle more importantly than a race issue alone. So now we're gonna leave the ugly part there and go to some really neat things about some black people like Elizabeth Key Grinstead and Elizabeth Freeman and Phyllis Wheatley and people like that, um, and that were notable in the colonial era of American history, what they did, what they were known for, and then we'll move on to those who fought in the Revolution, those who fought uh, in our wars, and mention people like Crispus Attucks, Prince Whipple. So this is all coming up. I just want to get past that ugly part where did have some blacks that owned slaves, just as you had Native Americans who owned slaves. So slavery was as the communists saw it, and I think rightly so. I'm not a communist, but I don't like communists, don't agree with them, and I think our country is in deep trouble because of their influence. But as the communists rightly saw it, it was more even than a racial struggle. It was a class struggle. So we'll discuss this more in detail next, and I hope you'll study American history and draw your own conclusions. And I really enjoy doing this, and I hope you enjoy studying American history.